This is Changemakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's Changemaker is Kathryn Monet, the CEO of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, a nonprofit organization that provides emergency and supportive housing for hundreds of thousands of homeless veterans each year. Kathryn has spent over a decade in the public and nonprofit sector working to address housing instability and homelessness amongst veterans. Kathryn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you, Katie.
I am glad you're here, and it's great to have you and really feature what you're doing. But before we dive into the complexities, will you tell us, how did you come into this specific line of work?
That's a great question. It was a little bit by accident. I sort of came to this work by way of policy making. For about 6 years, I was working at the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. And for part of that time, I was actually handling the housing and homelessness portfolio for a couple of different members, because we had a lot of turmoil and changeover at that time. And I think that was probably one of the only issues in my portfolio then that stayed consistent, because it was the only one that I liked. And so every time we had a new boss, I'd be like, okay, great, I'm happy to work for you. You can switch around my portfolio, but I need to keep the homelessness part, and everything else you can change. I think it was just something that I kind of grew passionate about as I learned a lot more about it.
So you started in policy making, and how did your journey bring you to the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans?
I kind of stuck with it. So when I left the Hill, I left to take a job at the National Alliance to End Homelessness to head up their veterans portfolio work. And then this job at NCHV opened up, and I kind of applied partially on a whim, right? Like literally on the night before the job opening closed. And I was like, well, I'm going to regret if I don't do it. So let me just try and see what happens. And I was fortunate enough to be chosen as the CEO. And that was, I guess, about 5 years ago.
You've been there for 5 years, like you mentioned. And how has it been to be CEO there? And, really, especially through the pandemic, what have you seen over the last 5 years happening?
I think it's been wonderful. And a part of that is because I've got a really great board and a really great team that works with me. We've made a lot of really great progress. It's been interesting, right? When you think about the numbers on veteran homelessness, we have seen about a 50% decline in veterans experiencing homelessness on any given night over the last decade. That said, it does feel like some of the progress stalled a little bit for a few years, and we're hoping to reinvigorate efforts moving forward.
Let's start with the big picture. And I want to make sure that we are extending sensitivities to all the issues. But part of this conversation we're going to have is also about awareness, understanding, compassion, action, all of it. First, before we get going, help us understand why homelessness happens amongst veterans.
Well, homelessness is really complex. And what I will say is that some of the reasons that veterans become homeless are the same as what you'd see in a civilian population, right? A crisis of housing affordability. Potentially you might have employment, but when you think about the ways in which the minimum wage has changed or has not changed, right? Even though housing costs have increased dramatically over the last decade or so, it's hard for people to afford things and make hard choices. And so I think bigger picture, we're thinking about the housing market, we're thinking about the labor market. To some degree, some of the longer term impacts of systemic and institutional racism, right? Look at how overrepresented certain populations are within the population of people experiencing homelessness. But then when you lay over that some of the specific issues that veterans face when they're coming out of the military or due to their service in the military, I think it can get even a little more complex.
How does inflation affect specifically homeless veterans? I mean, you're starting to talk about the market dynamics of affordability and wage and labor and accessibility of affordable housing. But what about specifically about inflation here?
So I think inflation has created additional pressures, right? Where, we're seeing folks who are at risk of homelessness and are kind of on the brink where they're making a set amount of money. They might have some VA disability compensation, But I mean, we're hearing from veterans on our hotline that some of them are seeing dramatic increases in their rent from their landlord. They're seeing gas prices go up and now down maybe a little bit. They're seeing increases in, costs of prescription medicines, costs of food. And at some point, if you've only got a finite budget, something's got to give somewhere.
Mm-hmm. So, what is the data on homelessness? How many people are impacted, or maybe where, what regions? Give us some descriptions about the actual data related to homelessness amongst veterans.
Yeah, so the most recent big national picture that was published that was comprehensive was for 2020 because of the ways that COVID has affected how we've started to count. So there aren't 2022 numbers out for the whole nation yet, but in 2020, it was just over 37,000 veterans experiencing homelessness on any given night. Predominantly, we see that those folks are located in states like California, New York, Florida, and Texas. We see a dramatic overrepresentation of Black and Native veterans within the population of veterans experiencing homelessness. We also see growing numbers of women and to some degree transgender veterans as well. And I do think that the other big kind of subpopulation that isn't always talked about because it's not really counted in that way or reported in that way is aging veterans. And there is kind of this growing group of older veterans who is experiencing homelessness that organizations are kind of struggling to serve.
So, with such a diverse population that you're trying to meet the needs of, how do you go about this? Do you start looking at transitional housing or permanent housing, or where's your focus, or is housing regardless of whether it's transitional or permanent?
So I do think that there is a need for a variety of solutions to meet the variety of needs that veterans experience. And any housing or shelter option that moves folks towards the path of permanent housing is always a good thing. I don't think it's an either or, where communities should invest only in transitional housing or only in permanent housing. I do think that, we are in an environment and a world, unfortunately, where resources are limited. And so communities are actively and annually making decisions about whether to invest in permanent housing or transitional solutions or crisis response or what have you. But I do think the one thing that I can say is that there is a rise in communities who are seeking to invest in law enforcement as a solution to homelessness. And that, I will say this right now, that is not the best answer for the people experiencing homelessness. So I do think anything that moves folks forwards towards permanent housing and creates more housing availability is a good solution.
And we're talking about housing as being one of the solutions, but I'm sure there are a lot of other solutions that have to be incorporated to really meet their needs. Give us a glimpse of what that would look like if you're providing a full service response to the needs of the individual experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, well, so I think one of the things that's really interesting about the system of care for veterans is that it's a lot more comprehensive, right? So veterans experiencing homelessness often get housing placements, but they also get connected to healthcare, right, through the VA healthcare system. In many communities, they get connected to employment supports via the Department of Labor's HVRP program. There's a whole host of other services to meet individual needs from, reentry and justice-involved veterans all the way over to, LGBTQ plus services for women with children and such. And so the holistic look at services kind of depends on who the veteran is and what they're seeking. But it does, to me, feel like housing has never been just the solution, right? And I think in the veteran space, we have been really great about pushing for the fact that housing should come with the services that the veteran wants and needs. And it shouldn't just be, great, here's your house, now you can sleep in it, but you don't have a bed and nobody's really checking up on you and we're kind of leaving you there. Good luck,
And we're talking about veteran as if it's a singular person. Are you seeing one person, or is it them and their families?
So it's a mix. What I will say is that I think when you compare the veteran population to the civilian population, veterans are more likely to be single and unaccompanied. But there is a growing population of veterans now that, we've experienced a couple decades of the post 9/11 era, right? And it does seem like when we're seeing families, oftentimes they're families with younger children. And so the system has been forced to adapt. And I mean, I don't think that for VA, this is specific even to just homeless services, right? I mean, when you think about the ways that they're delivering healthcare, even they're starting to adapt to be more welcoming to veterans who are parenting and bringing along their children or not able to bring their children to their appointments.
One of the frustrating things of working in the affordable housing industry as a whole, whether it's veterans, civilians, elderly, family, whatever the designation is, there's a lot of stigmas surrounding homelessness, particularly. What would you say is some of the most frustrating stigmas surrounding homeless veterans? And are you seeing ways to combat that?
So I think if I'm thinking about the most harmful stigma, it would be that people experiencing homelessness are very different than you and I. I'll be really honest with you, Katie. When I started working on homelessness, I wasn't very interested in it. I was kind of like, I don't know, I guess I have to go to shelters and learn about these people and figure out, what makes them tick and how we can do better by them. But it wasn't until I actually started diving in and kind of looking at what does it mean by the federal definition to be homeless? And as I was reading it, I realized like, oh my goodness, if you're doubled up, and you're just like staying with somebody on their couch, right? Like you qualify as homeless for Department of Ed services. And then I got to thinking about my childhood, and I grew up in Hawaii, in a very high cost market. And in my community, there were so many families that were doubled up. In fact, my family was doubled up. And it wasn't until I was like, I kind of realized like, yes, these people, like they're me, they're my family, they're my like, so many people that I knew who would have qualified for assistance under this program or that program or the other. And like, how can I not care? And so I do think that this kind of stigma of othering people who experience homelessness and, feeling like they're very different than us is harmful in many ways, because it leads people to think about, well, it's just those people over there who are making bad choices, so they don't deserve services or they don't deserve support, or why should we create affordable housing for them in our communities? And, when you actually go in and look at your communities, these are largely people who've been there for a long time and have had some precipitating event that has led them to be unable to afford housing. And so I do think maybe the number one stigma is that people experiencing homelessness are not like us at all, whoever we conceive ourselves to be.
Yeah, and breaking down what is causing the housing instability, or what is causing whatever it is, the restlessness or the inability to accept a sense of place in a community, can all be tracked down to various unique things that I would say as part of a veteran. Just even from my own personal experience, my dad served in Vietnam. And when he came back, as a family, we moved 30 times just in a really short period of time, because every few months he had to keep moving, and he had a cycle that was trying to stay in front of. And, you think about housing instability and homelessness and what's going on in the life of the individual, wherever they are in that veteran spectrum, so to speak. It does impact their housing choices or their access. So, this is a very complex topic as we're walking through the who they are, where are they, why are they in homelessness. Tell us about solutions, though. Who's doing it right? Do you have examples, government entities or nonprofits who are working to end veteran homelessness?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good that's happening out there. And I'm really glad you asked this question, Katie, because sometimes when you talk about homelessness, it's so easy to get caught up in, the darkness and the hard parts, and it's very easy to kind of lose track of the good that's happening out there. One of the things that you probably should know is that as a part of the major decrease that I was talking about earlier, 83 communities in 3 states have actually already achieved the federal benchmarks and criteria for ending veteran homelessness. So there are lots of places where things are going really well and communities are kind of coming together in interesting ways to tackle this problem collectively. I think when I think a lot about solutions, right, I think about kind of 3 key components that you see in every community. And I think the first is, really strong local leadership and someone locally kind of stepping up to own the problem and encourage the community to move forward towards a solution. I think the second thing we see is strong funding, right? And usually that's strong funding that comes from the federal level down into the community to really support their ability to execute programs that will work for the veterans of their community, whether it's permanent supportive housing, crisis housing, service intensive transitional, rapid rehousing, whatever flavor it is that they think they need to meet the needs of the veterans in their community. And I think the third really key component is implementing what we sort of call evidence-based practices, right? And kind of doing things that we know work and have been proven to end veteran homelessness. So things like focusing in on housing interventions, creating by name lists and understanding who's in your community and what they actually want and need to access in order to resolve their housing instability and, things like that. There are a number of communities that have done that really well. And I do think that to some degree, all of the coordination that is needed is harder to pull off in larger cities, right, than in your kind of medium-sized and smaller cities, but not totally impossible.
So tell us about the VASH vouchers, the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing vouchers, and do you have specific success stories of veterans that have used these vouchers?
Yeah, I think there are right now around 80 to 90,000 HUD-VASH vouchers out in the community. A lot of them are in the hands of veterans. I do think that there are some that are set aside for project basing and some that may be going underutilized for, reasons related to staffing or kind of slow release and such. And I think that that's a concern that we are continuing to monitor and work with VA on. But absolutely, there are tons of veterans. Actually, one of the veterans that serves on the VA Advisory Committee for Homeless Veterans with me is a veteran who he's had a really interesting story. He's one of my favorite parts about that committee. But he was a master carpenter in his younger life. I guess kind of thought that he had saved enough for retirement, retired, right? Because carpentry is not the easiest job on an aging body, right? After you've been through the military and have all of your musculoskeletal related issues from rucking everywhere and carrying your pack all over the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
he retired, but what he found was that he hadn't saved up enough for retirement. And so he actually ended up falling into homelessness for a little while. And what was really great was that, when the community found him, they connected him to services. And he's local, so he's here in the DC area where I am. And so he actually got connected to transitional housing with an organization called US Vets DC. And they offer some really amazing wraparound services. And I think they were able to help him with a security deposit. And he moved into a permanent supportive housing building with a HUD-VASH voucher. And he's now housed.
Excellent.
He's got a new job. He's thriving. I think he's getting very close potentially to being over income for his voucher and kind of graduating off of it. But he's sort of doing all the right things and is thriving now.
Excellent. From your policy background, are there any policy changes you'd like to see with that program specifically?
I do think that as we see the population of veterans experiencing homelessness aging a little bit, we'd love to see more of a focus on project basing, not only because of the way that it kind of centralizes services on site, but because it also helps with housing development, right? When you're thinking about those operating costs and how you secure your funding to actually pull the project together. I think that's definitely one major thing. We have been working a little bit with some of our national partners and folks on the Hill to look at what it might look like to allow some of the vouchers to be used for veterans who are exiting homelessness but maybe aren't chronically homeless. And I think that could be a positive change that is hopefully going to come soon.
Excellent. Well, hang on, Kathryn. We need to take a break here, but coming up in the second part of my conversation with Kathryn Monet, the CEO of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. Kathryn talks about the impact of VA's rapid rehousing program during the pandemic.
Because it is so flexible, VA was really able to innovate with it, and they're now able to offer shallow subsidies to veterans, so veterans can have longer-term, greater housing stability.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.